Chapter 20. The Last Time. Misaki came to the logical conclusion that she was in hell. In her addled brain, it was the only thing that made sense. No Dunian night could stretch as long as that night in Takayubi's bomb shelter. Somewhere in the chaos, a bullet had hit her and sent her soul spinning into the fires of eternity. A twisted soul like hers couldn't possibly pass into the peace of the Laxara. It made sense. But in the morning, the loudspeakers declared the area secure, and the bunker doors opened to the daylight of the mortal realm. The brightness was blinding at first. Misaki blinked around her, confused to find herself in the real world, hurting and alive. In her daze, she looked down and realized Izumo wasn't in her lap. Panic jolted her to her feet, sending splinters of pain through her chest. Her hands groped around her, fumbling over Siradenya's empty sheath, but there was no baby. Izuku-kun. She turned, frantic. Nagakuen. Her adjusting eyes found Ayumi in the arms of one of the Mizumaki women, but where were her sons? She had just taken a breath to scream when she found them. Her shoulders relaxed and she let out a soft, "Oh." Izumo was cradled in a pair of soot-stained arms, sound asleep against Atsushi's chest. At some point in the night, perhaps in search of human contact, or to quiet the crying Misaki was too far gone to hear, the blacksmith's son must have taken the infant. Nagisa had wormed his way under one of Atsushi's arms and fallen asleep with his head resting against Izumo's, while Hiroshi leaned against the huddle with his back to the other children. They made a strange picture, the Kotetsu boy in his smith's tunic and the Matsuda boys in their fine kimono, all tangled together, splattered with blood and dirt. Tears had dried in the ash on Atsushi's cheeks, indicating that he had cried himself to sleep. Yet the 10-year-old had held the Matsuda boys through the night, while their parents were too frozen to do so. Hiroshi was the first to blink awake in the brittle morning light. Or maybe he had never been asleep. The circles under his eyes suggested that he had spent the night as Misaki had, staring ahead into the darkness. "Are you all right, Hirokuen?" Hiroshi's eyes were veined with blood as he looked up at his mother. Stiffly, he nodded. If some part of her second son had ever truly been a child, it was gone now. Misaki's eyes moved to the Numo boy, holding her two youngest. She didn't want to wake him. Atsushi. Reaching out, she gently touched the boy's shoulder. Atsushi-kun. He stirred. His lips moved. "Ka-chan," he said softly, and Misaki had to swallow an unbidden swell of guilt. "No, Atsushi-kun," she said as he blinked bleary eyes. "It's me." Grief fought with embarrassment on his face. "Oh, I am Matsuda Dano. I'm so sorry." Misaki wanted to be able to give him a smile. Her face wouldn't do it. "It's all right, Atsushi-kun. Thank you for looking after my sons." She bent to take Izumo, but stopped with a grimace as the pain in her chest flared. "Are you all right, Matsuda Dano?" Atsushi asked. "Yes," Misaki said, though just getting the one word out hurt. "I can carry the baby if you need me to." "I'll take him," another woman said, the younger of the two Mizumakis who had helped carry the Matsuda babies the previous night. Fuyuko. That was her name. Her father and brother hadn't come back from the front lines. "If you don't mind, Matsuda Dano," the girl said, holding out her arms for Izumo. You don't have to do that," Misaki started to say, but her abused lungs stopped her again. "It's no trouble," Fuyuko said and carefully gathered Izumo into her arms. Misaki let the other woman carry Izumo as the villagers started to venture out of the bunker. She even took the arm Atsushi offered her for support as what remained of Takayubi stumbled out of the shelter into the light. Destruction spread out before them, smoking. The mayor's office near the bomb shelter's entrance had been obliterated, as had the Infocom tower beside it. "Try to watch your step, boys," Fuyuko warned Atsushi, Hiroshi, and Nagisa, lifting the hem of her own kimono to step over a beam from one of the fallen Infocom towers. "At least we got one good use out of these towers, huh?" Chulhi said to his father in Kaijengwa. He sounded numb. "I don't know if I would call this good," Taemin said. Bombs had left gaping holes in some houses. Most had been completely destroyed, reduced to splinters. Bodies littered the mountainside, many of them in pieces, Kaigenese and Ranganese all jumbled together in bits of blood and bone. As they walked, Misaki pulled Nagisa to her hip and put a hand over his eyes, as if she could truly shield him from any of this. The airstrike, while devastating, may not have been excessive. Judging by the number of yellow and black uniformed bodies strewn throughout the rubble, it seemed that the Ranganese had kept advancing up the mountain into the night, giving the pilots something to fire on. The result was that the village had been decimated. What remained of Takayubi's population spread out slowly, sluggish with grief and shock. Some clawed through the ruins of their houses for the bodies of their loved ones. Some simply stood where they had lived and raised their families, faces blank with disbelief. The village had been a necessary sacrifice. Misaki understood that, from a tactical standpoint. That was why she couldn't explain the rage and horror rising like bile in the back of her throat. She had seen devastation before. She had been in Livingston at the height of Kaliso's reign of terror, but somehow, back then, it hadn't seemed so bad. With no small amount of shame, she realized that, to her, those horrors belonged in violent Aden countries, far across the ocean. Not here. Not where she had rocked her babies to sleep and taught them their first words. Not where she had met Hayari. Not where she had laughed at Satsuko's jokes and cooking. For so many years, Misaki had thought she would never belong in Takayubi, but somehow, while she hadn't been paying attention, this place had become home. Someone had dropped bombs on her home. Hayari, whose wobbly legs had barely supported her down from the shelter, collapsed before the blackened ruins of the Yukino compound. The carved stone Yukino insignia that had been mounted above the doors now lay cracked in the snow. Hayari's fingers traced the stone grooves, shaking. Misaki felt a tug at her fingers and looked down to find that Nagisa had pulled her hand from his eyes. He was looking toward what remained of the Yukino compound, where he had spent so many days playing. "Ryota-kun?" he asked in a small voice. Hiroshi had stopped beside them, following his younger brother's gaze to the Yukino compound. "I think Ryota-kun is gone," he said slowly. "Where?" Nagisa looked from his big brother to his mother, eyes pleading. "Gone where?" Mizumaki Fuyuko said nervously, "Maybe we should get your boys away from here, Matsuda Dono?" She looked to Misaki. "Maybe into your own house?" "No." Misaki put up a hand to stop Fuyuko before she could guide Hiroshi and Nagisa in the direction of the Matsuda compound. "Not until it's cleaned up." What Misaki had left inside the house was easily worse than anything the children were going to see outside it. "How?" The young woman looked around. "How is it going to get cleaned up? There are so few of us and so much destruction. The Imperial Army should be here to help soon," Misaki said. She wasn't expecting much in the way of aid from the Kaigenese military, but it would be strange for them to make no appearance at all. At the very least, they would provide the manpower to move some of the bodies. But the first aid to arrive didn't come from the government. It came from the surrounding villages. Fishermen, farmers, and smiths, who had seen the tornado advancing from the coast in their direction, who had seen where it had stopped. They appeared as the sun cleared away the last of the mists. When the Takayubi residents went to meet them, they saw, with a swell of hope, that some of the volunteers were carrying survivors from further down the mountain. Atsushi was the first one to find the face he was looking for. "Tusan," he cried out. Kotetsu Katashi was being supported up the path by two fishermen. He was barely conscious, missing his left leg below the knee, but he still managed a wide smile as his son came running to meet him. Atsushi's younger brother and sister were alive as well, being carried by a pair of fisherwomen. A single, bruised Fina and a pair of frightened children were the only survivors anyone had found in the leveled western village. There was no sign of Mamoru. "We've left a few men further down the mountain to keep searching for survivors," the oldest of the fishermen explained. "Very good," Takaru said. "Thank you for your help." "It's all of us who need to thank you, Matsuda Dono." The man got on his knees, and the rest of the volunteers followed suit, bowing low in the snow before Takaru. "You and your people stopped this army before it could reach the rest of us. We can never thank you enough." As villagers tearfully reunited with their family members, a surprisingly lucid Kotetsu Katashi explained that the Numiwu with good enough legs had scattered when the Ranganese attacked. Of course, many had been caught and killed, but those first Ranganese to break through had been few enough that a good number of smiths escaped. Our house was destroyed almost immediately, he said, before we could think of fleeing. Fortunately, my two little ones were small enough to crawl out from under the debris and run before any Fanyukala found us. With the possible exception of the Matsusdas and Yukinos, the old blacksmith families knew the mountainside better than anyone. Atsushi's younger siblings, along with several other Numiwo, had taken shelter in caves that were all but impossible for an outsider to find. After applying a tourniquet to his own exploded leg, Katashi had managed to drag himself to the safety of the nearest cave with his powerful arms. Takayubi's rock formations had acted as natural bomb shelters, protecting the Numiwa not only from the Ranganese, but also the subsequent airstrike. They had stayed hidden underground until they heard the Kaigenese voices of the fishermen calling out for survivors. Astonishingly, 3 men had survived the carnage at the northern pass: 32-year-old Ginkawa Aoki, 43-year-old Aikino Tsuyosa, and his 17-year-old cousin, Aikino Shun. During the initial clash with the Fanyukalu, Ginkawa had taken a blow to the head that had rendered him unconscious and had lain ignored for the rest of the attack. He had regained consciousness at the beginning of the airstrike and then risked the bombs to crawl among the corpses in search of survivors. In the dark, he had managed to drag the 2 wounded Ainos to safety. Somberly, he told the desperate group of wives and mothers that there had been no other beating hearts in that darkness. Aikino Tsuyosa had lost an arm, and the 17-year-old was even worse off, having suffered multiple stab wounds to the torso and severe head trauma that had left him delirious. "We brought them here, hoping you might have medics to tend to the wounded," the elder fisherman told Takaru, "maybe a building to set up operations." He looked around at the smoldering remains of the main village. "I'm so sorry, Matsuda Dono. We didn't realize this place had been so badly bombed. We will set up a base of operations in my home," Takaru said, indicating the remaining half of the Matsuda compound. "We may have to clear out some Ranganese corpses and brace parts of the roof with ice, but I believe it is the building with the most structural integrity at this moment." Turning from the fisherman, Takaru raised his jia where a portion of the compound's outer wall had been destroyed. He knocked out some of the loose bricks and then flattened a sheet of packed snow over the fallen pieces of wood and rock, creating a path into the part of the compound that was still standing. "You and you." He pointed to 2 of the tallest fishermen. "Come help me clear out the bodies and debris." "Yes, Matsuda Dono," the men said and scrambled to obey. "We'll freeze the Fanyaka bodies in the courtyard until we have occasion to dispose of them," Takaru said, not looking back as the men followed him into the compound. "Make sure you clean up as much blood as you can after you move each corpse. The place must be properly sanitized before we move in the weak and wounded." The fishermen left outside quickly set about helping the people of Takayubi form makeshift benches and shelters of ice against the compound's outer wall. For a different community of Theonites, shelter would have been a more immediate concern in the midst of a mountain winter, but Kusanagi Jijakalu were different. Their subconscious jia allowed their blood to keep circulating even when their body temperature dropped below freezing. It was how Misaki had spent the entire night barefoot without suffering frostbitten toes. Even a baby as young as Izumo, now asleep in Fuyuko's arms, was in little danger from the cold. Of course, even well-bred Jijakalu could not survive forever outdoors in the winter. Within a few days, they would start to run out of energy and freeze. Without food, it would be sooner. Blankets were recovered from ruined houses and draped over ice wedges to form comfortable seats for the elderly and injured to rest on while they waited for the Matsuda compound to be cleaned out. Fisher women formed cradles for Izumo, Ayumi, and the other babies, padding them with blankets and spare clothing. By the time the fishermen had set up in the Matsuda compound, more volunteers had arrived. These were warriors and blacksmiths from Takayubi's 2 nearest neighboring mountains. The Tetsukai blacksmith family had brought medics with them, including 2 city-trained doctors. The professionals immediately took control of first aid, directing others what to do. The representatives from the Amino stronghold on the neighboring mountain of Tatsuyama had brought baskets of food and a dozen warriors to assist in the search for survivors. Misaki and the children were guided into the compound. Takashi's study, which the man had barely ever used anyway, had been converted into a small hospital. Setsuko was already lying on some blankets, still unconscious, as two medics bent over her. "None of us are seriously injured," Misaki assured the Tetsukai medic as he guided her into the room and asked that she sit. "Sorry, Matsuda Dono. Your husband insisted that we examine you." The most concerning of Misaki's injuries was the persistently painful stabbing in her chest from the fan-wielder's laser Linghun. If her lungs were truly damaged, it would take more than a few bandages to fix it, but she humored the Numu anyway, allowing him to disinfect and bandage the cuts on her arms. As soon as the medic had moved on to check Nagisa for injuries, Misaki knelt forward and tugged Hiroshi toward her. "Keep an eye on your little brothers and cousin," she whispered in his ear. "Ka-chan should be back soon." "Where are you going?" Hiroshi asked. "I'm going to go find your brother." Misaki rested a hand on his head for a moment before slinking out of the room and down the hall. She made a stop at a surviving closet to hide Saradenya's sheath and get herself a pair of tabi. "Hello, Matsuda Dono," Kotetsu Katashi said when he noticed her stepping lightly toward the compound's back door. The swordsmith had Atsushi and one of the fishermen cleaning his wounded leg and taking steps to prevent infection, while his younger children sat nearby. "And where are you headed?" he asked, managing quite the amicable tone for a man who had just lost a leg and a third of his family. Katashi's smile faded and he lowered his gaze. "You won't find him on the front line where the others died." "What?" "Atsushi was the last one to see him, I think." Katashi looked toward his son, who nodded. "At the blacksmith village, ma'am, near what used to be our house." "Thank you," Misaki said with as much affection as she could muster, and slipped out of the compound. She was under no delusion that she would blend in on the slopes with the volunteers. It wasn't that she was the only woman, there were other wives and mothers eager to find their warriors, but she was the only noblewoman. "Please, Matsuda Dono," one of the fishermen said, noting the insignia on her kimono. "You should go back and rest. We'll carry the dead and wounded back to you. This is no place for a lady." I've seen worse," Misaki meant to say, but the words stopped painfully in her throat. The slope leading down to the front line was terrible. Here lay the blacksmiths who had run for the caves but never made it. Further down lay the bodies of warriors. It was hard to tell if they had been pushed back from the northern pass or if they had come up the slope deliberately when they heard the screams of civilians further up the mountain. There was Amino Samusa, the elementary school sword instructor who had taught Hiroshi and Mamoru before him. There was the Numu woman who had crafted Misaki's wedding jewelry, hand in hand with her husband, who came around every 3 months to clean and repair the Matsuda compound's roof. Volunteers paused hopefully at each body, checking for signs of life, but so far it seemed that they hadn't had any luck. Anyone who had fallen to injury out here on the open slopes had almost certainly been hit by the Imperial Army's bullets or debris from their bombs. Misaki had seen dismembered bodies before, messes of blood and internal organs, people hacked into pieces by machetes. But she hadn't felt it then. After all, Livingston, Carida had been an exotic land of morbid curiosities and exhilarating danger. That had been the real difference between herself and Robin Thundiel. For him, the tragedy of Livingston's slums had been real. To Misaki, the privileged daughter of an untouchable noble house a world away, it had only been a game, a passing thrill to sate her thirst for adventure. It hadn't quite been real. This was real. "Please, Matsuda Dono," one of the fishermen was saying, his voice very far away. "A lady shouldn't have to see this." "No," Misaki said quietly. "No one should have to see this." How had she been so cavalier with lives that meant something to Robin? How had she shrugged off atrocities and then called it strength? Here on the slopes of her mountain, where every corpse was a personal loss, she did not feel strong at all. "Why don't you go back to your family, Matsuda Dono?" the fisherman asked. "I'm missing a part of it," she replied. "I need to find my son." "Then at least let me accompany you, ma'am. Parts of this slope may still be dangerous." Misaki didn't need an escort to find her way, but she thanked the fisherman anyway and let him follow along. He might not have the authority to order her back to the main village, but it simply wasn't good manners to let a lady wander into the aftermath of a battle alone. "What's your name, fisherman?" she asked as they picked their way down the steep path. It may have been a strange time for small talk, but Misaki found that she couldn't bear the silence. It left her too much room to contemplate where she was going, what she would inevitably find. "Chiba Mizuiro, Matsuda Dano." His voice carried the eager anxiety of a man who did not often get to talk to members of high houses. "Chiba." Misaki smiled in a weak attempt to put the man at ease. "My sister-in-law is a Chiba, you know." "Matsuda Setsuko-sama," he said. "Yes, I heard about that marriage." Of course he had. It had been quite the scandal. "My branch of the family was close with hers." "The fishing village at the base of this mountain," Misaki said, "where the tornado touched down first. What kind of shape is it in?" "It's not in any shape, Matsuda Dano. It's gone. If it weren't for the little pieces of wood and the odd scrap of netting, you would never know there was a village there at all." "I'm so sorry to hear that." Misaki tried to focus on that, on the tragedy of the lost fishing village and her sympathy for Setsuko. It was by no means a pleasant thought. In fact, it was quite painful, but that was the point. It was almost painful enough to take her mind off where her feet were carrying her. Almost. "So, I assume there are no survivors?" she asked. "Not that we could find," Chiba said, though a few of us stayed behind to look, mostly people hoping to find their lost relatives. Misaki nodded. "Poor Setsuko. Poor Setsuko." "I saw the tornado," he said. "My wife and daughters were crying by the time it touched down. We thought we were all going to die." "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That must have been terrible for you." "Please don't apologize, Matsuda Dano," Chiba said fiercely. "If it weren't for you and your family, none of us would be here now. I only regret we can't do more to help." Misaki cast a glance at her escort, meeting his earnest gaze. Matsuda Susumu had always complained that the peasants and lesser houses of the peninsula were not loyal the way they had been when he was young. He talked about the days when all the people of Kusanagi had respected and revered the Matsuda house. During the Kaliba, the great families of Shirajima had earned their vassals' loyalty through their indisputable shows of strength against Kaigen's enemies. The Matsuda house might have raised powerful fighters every generation since the Kaliba, but no one in Misaki's generation had witnessed the proof of that power, until now. It seemed that a fragment of that ancient wonder had stirred from sleep when the people of Kusanagi's coast saw a tornado fall before the power of Takayubi. Loyalty was born of the awe shining in this fisherman's eyes. And now, Corona poured up the mountain, eager to serve however they could. "Your son and your brother-in-law, all of you who fought here, are heroes," Chiba said fervently. "We owe you our lives." She couldn't say whether it made her happy or sad that Matsuda Susumu had not lived to see this loyalty revived. She wished she could feel something, anything other than the inevitability of each step down toward the end of her world. By this time, the charred remains of the blacksmith village were in sight, growing closer with each step. "You know, I've never had much occasion to visit the other fishing villages in this region," Misaki said too quickly, her voice high with strain. "Tell me more about your village." "Oh." The man looked surprised. "But Matsuda Dano, don't you think we should look for tell me," Misaki demanded sharply, "about your house, your boat, your family. Talk to me about something. Just take me away from here." They were skirting the smoking remains of the Numu village, where the familiar smell of burned wood and coal had mixed with the insidious stench of charred flesh. "Your most successful fishing excursion," she said desperately. "Tell me about that." "All right, Matsuda Dano," Chiba said uncertainly. Most of my family's income doesn't come from fish. My wife is an excellent pearl diver, a skill she's started to pass on to my daughters. We sell the pearls to Numiwu for them to use in their jewelry and baubles for ladies like you." Misaki tried to focus on Chiba Mizuiro's words even as her eyes had started to scan the ashy, blood-stained snow. She tried to be there with the pearl diver and her daughters on that boat. "I worry about my wife sometimes, the way she dives so far down into the dark on days when the waters are violent. My mother died diving for pearls, you see. So do many women every year. I worried more than ever when my oldest daughter started going out with my wife. And when we decided my youngest was ready to try, well, I thought I might die from nerves. But the water was so placid and clear that first day all three of them dove together. It was like Nami was so happy to see them that she cleared the coast of waves and sharks and sharp rocks just for them. I barely caught any fish that day, but the goddess filled my girls' hands with pearls. That sounds wonderful, Misaki said, trying with all her might to feel a sliver of the fishing family's joy. Of course, she couldn't. She had never had to dive for her riches. If she wanted pearl necklaces or hair ornaments, someone brought them to her. She had never given much thought to the pearls themselves or the people who risked their lives to gather them from the ocean floor. I think that was the day I understood that this peninsula really was blessed by the blood of gods. City people come through sometimes and say it's dying, but divinity lives here. Divinity? Misaki's voice seemed to come from somewhere far away. Her eyes had fallen on a thin shape in the snow, Mamoru's sword. The blade was drenched in blood. I watched a tornado stop here, Chiba said earnestly, before it could reach my village. I think this is a place of miracles. Just like my mother used to tell me, for every diver the ocean takes, there is a perfect day when she showers a family with bright pearls and love. Misaki's feet crunched to a stop in the snow, and the fisherman's gaze followed hers. The black-clad soldier before them was in two pieces, cut in half by what must have been a brutally decisive stroke of the katana. And there, facing him in the snow, barely a stride away, was Mamoru. The indiscriminate spray of bullets had left holes in the back of his kimono, singed circles piercing the diamonds of the Matsuda crest. Merciful Nami, the fisherman exclaimed in undisguised disgust. Those pilots just shot right through him. What if he was still alive? He wasn't, Misaki said softly. Thank the gods for that. There wasn't space in her heart for any more rage. How can you tell? Chiba asked. There's barely any bleeding from the bullet wounds, Misaki said numbly. What? There was no blood flow when the bullets hit his body. His heart stopped beating long before that. The fisherman was eyeing her, visibly unsettled. How can you tell? Before I married into the Matsuda family, I was Susano Misaki. I know blood. She noticed the man shift a fraction of a step back. Superstitious. Could you please give me a moment with my son? Yes, of course, Matsuda Dano. Just. Chiba Mizuiro got down on his knees and bowed before the body until his forehead was buried in the snow. A quiet prayer passed his lips. Then he shuffled to face Misaki and bowed again, just as deeply. Nayama to you, Matsuda Dano, and to your son. God's willing, Misaki murmured, and he withdrew, leaving her alone with the body that was no longer Mamoru. In her mind, Misaki had compared the bomb shelter to hell. But this clarity of stillness, was worse. The bizarre thing about Misaki was that she could be at home in hell. Chaos had its own calming effect on her. In the bunker, the screams, the pulsing blood, and the gunfire had drowned each other out, smothering her in a daze. Here, there was no fluid crawl of blood or dribble of tears to consume Misaki's attention. This blood had frozen into something solid and irrefutable. There was no movement to spur her to action, nothing to mend or destroy. There was only the frozen truth of her son's death. Slowly, Misaki sank to her knees beside the corpse. Her eyes traced the details, preserved in the cold. The bullet wounds may not have bled, but there was plenty of frozen blood to survey, a map of Mamoru's struggles leading up to his death. Minor cuts littered his face and forearms. Bruising and raw skin around his neck suggested that someone had tried to strangle him, and his lip was split from a blunt blow to the mouth, but none of that had killed him. It was clear that his death had resulted from the deep blade wound in his side. Misaki wished she hadn't seen wounds like that before on the victims of machete attacks in Livingston. She wished she hadn't witnessed firsthand how excruciatingly long it took those people to die. The Fanyaka opposite Mamoru had been cut cleanly in half by a sword stroke that ran from his right hip to just beneath his left arm, the sort of cut that ended a man's life instantly. Even the greatest fighter in the world couldn't get up for a counterattack after that. Mamoru's blow had been the final one, which could only mean that her boy had fought through the injury that ended his life. Even with that hideous wound in his side, draining his blood and disabling vital organs, he had fought. His right hand was mangled, missing 2 fingers, so she reached out and touched his left, smoothing a gentle touch over his battered knuckles. The first time Misaki had held Mamoru, as a tiny baby, she had hated the feel of his Jia simply because it reminded her of his father's. It had made her want to retch and recoil. Now she reached for it, her fingers grasping and senses straining for the smallest trace, but of course, there was nothing. The life force that had made him Mamoru had departed, on its way to a different realm of existence. A breathless sob escaped Misaki. Her ice-laced fingers dug into the back of her son's kimono and she wished, from the depth of her aching chest, that her claws could pull a life back to the Duna as easily as they could tear one out of it. The next breath that came out of her was more of a scream than a sob, and the pain it sent through her lungs was so pitifully small next to the sheer absence beneath her hands. She would let a Fanyaka pull her life from her mouth. She would give her soul 1,000 times over, if she could just bring Mamoru's back. It wasn't until she felt liquid blood on her fingers that she jerked back and realized what she was doing. As she longed to feel Mamoru's pulse and Nyama, her own subconscious had risen to pull at the lifeless body. It hadn't restored a true pulse, of course. All it had done was unfreeze arteries and disrupt rigor mortis, causing Mamoru's bullet wounds and other injuries to bleed anew. Horrified, Misaki scrambled a pace back from the body. "Sorry," she gasped, wiping the blood from her hands in the snow. "I'm so sorry." She bowed down, crushing her forehead into the frozen ground until it hurt, until ice and then rock ground into her brow. "I'm so sorry." She stayed there for a long time, pressed to the ground in apology as if there were enough apologies in the Duna to make up for how she had failed him. Closing her eyes, she prayed to Nagi for strength and Nami for calm. Neither obliged. Her blood-stained hands shook, even as she braced them against the ground for some semblance of stability. The sobs wouldn't stop, but she had not come here to confuse Mamoru's spirit and pull it in two. She had come here to help him, to be a good mother, if the gods would give her this last chance. One didn't need to be a Fina to understand that regret was like poison to the spirits of the dead. A spirit who regretted what he hadn't accomplished in life would be unable to pass into the peace of the Laxara. Those spirits became trapped in the burning realm on the fringe of the Duna, unable to truly die, their suffering intensifying as their regrets festered. It was a horrible existence. And it was the souls of those who died young, in the midst of hope, unfinished business, and unfulfilled potential who were in the most danger. Through the shaking, Misaki found the voice to speak to her son. "Kotetsu Katashi and Atsushi both lived, you know," she said softly. "The Kotetsu line survives, with all its knowledge, because of you." That was the first thing he needed to know, that he hadn't died for nothing. To Misaki, at this moment, the lives of the Kotetsu seemed irrelevant, but Mamoru was a better person than she was. It would matter to him. "I know you doubted. I know you worried that you wouldn't know what to do. But look at you, you fought so well." And with the grief, Misaki realized that there was also pride welling up in her throat. It intertwined with the pain, amplifying it. "You're only a boy, but you fought to the last like a man. You did well here. But I'm sure you know that." A painful, nearly hysterical smile jerked at the corners of Misaki's mouth. "No warrior could have fought through injuries like yours without being sure of himself." Misaki bit down on her trembling lip as her throat closed up. There were no holy men here to offer the perfect, enlightened words to send Mamoru's spirit on its way. As his mother, as the only living person here, Misaki had to find the words. This was the last thing she could do for him. So, even though it shook her body and hurt beyond imagining, she forced herself to keep speaking. "You did right by your family and your country, even though, I think, none of us did right by you. There is nothing in this world for you to regret. Nothing at all." But it wasn't Mamoru's regret Misaki truly feared. Her son had been honest with himself and others. He had lived well and died with purpose. Right now, Misaki herself was the greatest threat to her son's spirit. The regrets of a spirit's loved ones could also tie it down. The bitterness that consumed her could doom him to an eternity of fire, unless she found some way to be better. With a last bracing breath, she lifted her head to look into Mamoru's face and was surprised to find a kind of peace there. Somehow, The horrific damage to his body had done nothing to contort his features, as pale and clean as his father's, but gentler, like the bright edges of a moon barely softened by mist. His jaw wasn't clenched, nor was his brow crunched in pain. Instead, he had the innocently wondering look of someone halfway woken from a dream. His eyes, glazed and frosted from the cold, no longer functioned, but somewhere in the space between space, his spirit still saw her. He still listened. She looked into those eyes, using them to ground her as she started to speak. Mamoru-kun. The sound of her own voice wavering in uncertainty brought her back to the first time she had truly talked to her son, that dawn on the front deck mere months ago when they watched the sunrise. She hadn't quite known what to say then either to help him on his way. Start small, she told herself as she had then, conversational. The right words would follow if she just loosened her time-stiffened lips. Do you remember that morning, Mamoru? After you had that fight with Kwang Chulhi and asked for my help? You asked me if one day I would tell you about my school days, about my life before Takayubi. It made me so happy to hear you ask that, and I was looking forward to telling you those stories. They were going to be fun stories, adventure stories. I'm sure you would have liked them, but now I think, maybe those stories about Susanoo Misaki Sirawu, the shadow, didn't have as much value as I put on them. Maybe they weren't worth retelling or holding on to the way I did. See, Mamoru, there were certainly people in those stories who knew what they were fighting for, heroes who were noble and strong-willed, and worth remembering, like you. But I wasn't one of them. Sirawu was just that. A shadow. It was someone else's story, and I was just passing through it. This, you were my story, and I was so selfish, so tied to that shadow that I missed it. And my son, I'm so sorry it took me this long to understand. I'm sorry, the words caught in her throat, choking her until pain shot through her chest, forcing her to let them out. I never loved you the way I should have. Tears rolled down Misaki's cheeks. For the first time since coming to Takayubi, perhaps the first time in her life, she knew she was human. Acutely, unbearably human. Now that it was too late. Your mother is a selfish woman, Mamoru. She clutched a sleeve in her hand and wiped the tears from her eyes, only to have new ones well up in their place. I won't deny that. I've lived my life unable to let go of all the what-ifs, the if-onlys. For my husband, I couldn't let go of them. For the love of my life, I couldn't let go of them, and we've all suffered for it. It was the poison of my regret that killed my unborn children, those who would have come after you and before Hiroshi. My regret has poisoned this family for years, but I swear, Mamoru, I won't let it touch you. The thing is, you're more important than all of them. So, what I couldn't do for my parents, or Robin, or Takaru, or my unborn babies, I'll do it for you. My son, I'll do it for you. You've done more in this world than anyone could have asked. This once, let me be the mother I should have been from the beginning. Let me take care of the rest, all right? She crept forward to touch his hand again, but this time, she did not sob or pull. Her Jia was under control. She cried quietly, her tears falling without disturbance. She let him be still. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but please, if your poor, stupid mother can ask one last thing of you, let me hold you one more time. Just one more time, you're going to let Ka-chan hold you and treasure you the way I should have the day you were born. Then I'm going to let you go on with all my blessings. Is that all right? Finawa said it was not good for a woman to touch the dead, but Takayubi's Finawa had all been lost in the tornado with their temple. There was no one to judge Misaki as she gathered her boy into her arms and settled down to hold him for the last time. Please Nami, please Nagi, she prayed through the tears. He's such a good boy. Don't let his stupid mother ruin this for him. Please, give me the strength to let him go. A mother was supposed to go to the temple after the death of a child. She was supposed to speak to the spirits of the dead until she had said all she needed to say to the child, until all her unresolved feelings were spent, all conflicts resolved, all grudges laid to rest, until the Finawa were satisfied that the deceased could move on in peace. But the temple was gone, along with all the masks and wise monks in it. The best Misaki could do was hold her baby, and love him, and hope it was enough that she could let him go. You have no debt to pay the Duna. she murmured, resting her cheek against his cold head. It is enough that, even for a moment, I had a son like you. It is enough that Hiroshi, Nagisa, and Izumo will have a brother like you to look up to as they become young men themselves. It is enough, she told herself, even though she would never hear him laugh with his little brothers again, never watch him bring beauty to another kata, never see that boyish smile, with those dimples, deepen into the smile of a man. For a moment, her hands had been full of pearls. She rocked and repeated, "It is enough. It is enough. It is enough. It is enough," until Chiba Mizuiro returned with a group of volunteers to help her carry the body up the mountain. Before they left, Misaki paused before the corpse of the Ranganese soldier who had killed her son. Kneeling down, she passed a hand over his eyes, closing them, letting herself forgive him. It was easy to forgive a young man following orders. Too easy. And it didn't lift any of the weight from Misaki's chest because this Ranganese stranger wasn't the one who really needed forgiving. Chapter 21: The Stormlord. Setsuko woke later that day, complaining of a splitting headache with her usual good humor. When Misaki softly told her what had happened to her husband, she got very quiet. It was plain that she had been expecting the news. If Takashi had survived the battle, he would have been the one at his wife's side when she woke. "How did he go?" she asked finally. Was it possible to tell? "Fighting," Misaki said. That much had been easy to deduce. In fact, it was a bit of an understatement. Decimating or slaughtering might have been a more apt description of the scene Takashi had left on the southern pass. After sending Takaru up to the village to protect us, he was one of the last of our men standing. He and Mamoru. His body? Setsuko asked, strangely calm. "Well, there isn't really a body," Misaki explained. The volunteers had formed slabs of ice inside the Matsuda compound walls, where they placed the collected bodies. But there hadn't been much of Matsuda Takashi to collect. His bones had been placed in a woven basket. The volunteers retrieved his swords, but it seems like his death Jia was so strong, it turned all the blood in his body to spikes of ice. It was spectacular, Misaki added on a whim. Maybe it wasn't a very ladylike way to describe something so violent, but she thought Setsuko would want to know. Spectacular, huh? The satisfied look on Setsuko's face told Misaki she had thought right. And terrifying. Well, Setsuko managed a laugh. "Coming from you, I take that as high praise." The corner of Misaki's mouth twitched, but she couldn't quite return Setsuko's smile. Part of her had hoped that the blow to Setsuko's head had knocked out the memory of what she had witnessed during the attack on the Matsuda compound, the carnage Misaki had created. But if Setsuko was uncomfortable sharing her makeshift rubble bench with a monster, she didn't show it as she leaned forward. "Tell me more," she said. More? She wanted to know more about her husband's gruesome death. "I've never seen death Jia like it," Misaki said, and did her best to describe the bloody formation of spikes. "I've never known a fighter who was absolutely indomitable right to the last. From the look of the battlefield, he managed to take several Fanukalu with him at the moment of death, and that's to say nothing of the 100 or so he killed before that." Setsuko smiled a strange smile that teetered on a blade edge between savagery and adoration. "That's my husband," she said, her eyes full of tears. "And that's my Setsuko," Misaki thought as she clutched her sister-in-law's hands, vibrant, unbroken, even in the face of the unthinkable. "You hear that, Ayumi-chan?" Setsuko beamed through her tears as her baby woke and started fussing in her arms. "Your father's a hero and a god." Misaki wished she had Setsuko's strength. She had thought for so many years that what she had was strength, faking a smile through pain and anger, but this honest ability to smile from the heart was something beyond anything she had ever had. It was why she had followed Robin like a moth to a flame. It was why Setsuko was and always would be the most beautiful woman in the world. "Come, little one." Setsuko stood, nuzzling Ayumi to giggles. "Let's go pay our respects." "I told you, there's no body," Misaki said. "Yes." The smile faded from Setsuko's face as she looked at Misaki. "But I have to say goodbye to my brave nephew, don't I?" Misaki looked up at her sister-in-law in surprise. She had only just woken up. How did you?" Setsuko put a hand to Misaki's face, ran a gentle thumb beneath one of her eyes. "You're not much of a crybaby, little sister," she said softly. "I've never seen your eyes so red." Something in Misaki's expression must have broken through Setsuko's calm because for a moment, she looked sadder than Misaki had ever seen her. The hand on Misaki's cheek tugged her in. She took the invitation and leaned her head into Setsuko's chest. No words. Just silent support. Misaki closed her eyes, reminded of the way her mother used to hold her during a storm, assuring her children that the wind and thunder could never hurt them. It was a comfort Misaki knew she would never feel again, one she could never offer her own children. "I think I should apologize to you," Setsuko said finally, "since my husband isn't here to do it himself." "What do you mean?" "Takaru came back to protect us on his orders. He could have sent Mamoru and Mamoru would still be alive." It was something Misaki had been trying not to think about. "I'm sorry." "It's not your fault," Misaki said. "It wasn't even Takashi's, really." He must have realized that staying to hold the line meant certain death, that whoever he sent back up the mountain would have to head up the Matsuda house in his absence. Takashi himself could have exchanged places with Takaru, but Mamoru was too young. A 14-year-old could not lead the family, let alone the whole village, in a time of crisis. She ignored the little voice in her head that demanded to know why Mamoru couldn't have gone up the mountain with his father. Why hadn't Takaru insisted on it? How could he have left his own son to die without argument? How? It was necessary, Misaki insisted, as if it would do anything to lessen the ache. "You don't need to apologize to me." Setsuko rubbed Misaki's back. "But someone should." A steady stream of corpses on stretchers came up the mountain all day. It was horrible to hear the cries of grief and denial from family members that greeted each new body, but Misaki found that it was more horrible still to watch a body appear over the ridge to silence. Some of these people had died along with everyone who might remember them. They lay alone on their ice slabs, with no one to mourn them. As Setsuko went to speak to the fisherman who had collected her husband's bones, Misaki stood before Mamoru's body, one hand on Nagasa's head, one on Hiroshi's shoulder, and tried to explain to her sons. Nagase didn't understand. How could he at his age? He kept shaking Mamoru, asking why he wouldn't wake up. While Nagase kept clutching at Mamoru's sleeve, Hiroshi's hand trailed down slowly and rested on the lacquer sheath of his brother's sword. "Mamoru and Ai-san was firstborn," he said slowly. "Yes," Misaki replied. "And Uncle Takashi was firstborn." "He was," Misaki said, looking at Hiroshi. She watched his eyes narrow as his 5-year-old mind carefully worked its way up the hierarchy he had been born into. "So, I am." Hiroshi did not yet know the words heir or inheritor, but it was clear from the questioning way he looked up at Misaki that he had some notion of the concept. In the space of a single day, he had gone from being the second son of a second son to the Matsuda heir. Even if he couldn't fully understand the shift, he could feel it. His little shoulders had stiffened as if a physical weight had dropped onto them. His fists clenched, and Misaki realized that her second-born, who had been as steady as solid ice from the day he was born, was shaking. When she looked into his eyes, she saw something she had never seen there. Not even as he faced down a Ranganese soldier 4 times his size. Fear. "I'm not big enough yet," he said. "I'm not strong enough." "No." Misaki tried to smile at Hiroshi as she stroked his hair and put a hand on his shoulder. "You're not big enough, but you're plenty strong. If nothing else, Hirokuen, you're strong." Hiroshi didn't seem to hear her. "He can't go yet." He stared through her, looking almost fevered. "He can't. He's already gone, Hirokuen. There's nothing we can do about it. But he can't." Hiroshi's face twisted in anger, his eyes still unfocused. "I didn't catch up to him yet." As Nagase sobbed and Hiroshi shook quietly under her hands, it occurred to Misaki what a big piece of their world Mamoru had been. Not just a firstborn son, but a decade older than his younger brothers. He must have loomed so large to them. He had been a landmark and a bulwark between them and the far-off adult world. For Nagase, he had been a friend and protector. For Hiroshi, maybe he hadn't been a friend, but something more important. He had been something to chase after. "I didn't catch up to him yet. Listen, Hirokuen, that's all right. You don't have to stop chasing him." He won't be here with us anymore, but I'm sure his spirit would be happy to know you kept following his example. You can still grow up strong, like him, in time. But I'm not firstborn, Hiroshi protested, his voice strained with anxiety. I'm not big enough. Misaki understood at that moment that Hiroshi was struggling to voice a terror beyond his vocabulary. The firstborn Matsudas, Takashi and Mamoru, had been big to Hiroshi in more than their age and physical size. He was talking about the size of their skill, their strength, their responsibility. They had both been massively powerful figures in Hiroshi's world, responsible for dealing with the nondescript adult dangers the rest of the family could not. Now, both of them had died facing those dangers, leaving Hiroshi standing where they once had. Still so small. I'm not ready. I know, Hirokuen. None of us are. But we're going to do our best together, all right? Drawn tighter than a katakuri bowstring, Hiroshi nodded. Right now, we have to give Mamoru our prayers and help him on his way. The only thing we can do now is let him go without worrying too much about us. If you have anything you would like to say to your brother, any last things you feel he should know, you should offer them now. Hiroshi stood, considering his brother's body for a long moment. Then he stepped back and knelt down with his forehead to the ground. Misaki could only guess what passed between Hiroshi and his brother's spirit. It was impossible to tell if he berated Mamoru for leaving him, if he asked for strength, if he asked forgiveness for taking his place, if he made promises to grow strong and protect the family. But whatever he prayed, he must have felt it deeply. Because his jia rose with palpable force, turning the snow around him to ice. The whole time, Nagase didn't stop crying. What are we going to do about the funerals? Setsuko asked as she and Misaki sat on the half-destroyed front deck of the compound with their children. I don't know. Misaki was rubbing slow circles over Nagasa's back. For a long time, the boy had sobbed uncontrollably, but she had let him hold Izumo, which seemed to have calmed him down for the moment. I don't actually know how Takayubi deals with mass death like this. You nobles probably have a lot of extra fancy ceremonies, right? We do. The day after Matsuda Susumu passed away, it had seemed as if every monk in Takayubi showed up to dress the body, sing donkali, fuss over the ornamentation of the coffin, and prepare the cremation site. Misaki herself had spent Wadanu making sure her hair, obi, and bone-white kimono were all arranged just so, to avoid offending the spirit of her embittered father-in-law. After each of her miscarriages, the Finua had led her through so much prayer and fasting and purifying that she had thought it might never end. We should have covered the house shrine to protect it from evil spirits, Misaki said, recalling the one ritual that was always observed after a tragedy. Oh. Setsuko's shoulders slumped. The Matsuda shrine was in the part of the house that had collapsed completely. We could salt the area? Setsuko suggested. Right. Misaki sometimes forgot that the lower classes considered salt a catch-all antidote to the supernaturally sinister. On a peasant's budget, that was far more doable than sending for an exorcist monk every time a ghost came calling. Is my low breeding showing? Setsuko asked at the look on Misaki's face. No, it's not a bad idea, Misaki said wearily, but the salt is in the kitchen. The kitchen, while it had not been hit by any bombs, had been utterly destroyed in Misaki's fight with the two elite Fanyakalu. The broken faucet had continued spewing water well into the night, flooding the floor and the surrounding rooms. When Takaru and the volunteers cleaned the house, someone had frozen the spigot shut and erected an ice wall to prevent the water from spreading throughout to the rest of the compound, but the kitchen itself was unsalvageable. We also have no cemetery, Misaki said. The fishermen who were helping search for bodies said it was destroyed. The tornado had advanced well past the western village before the men of Takayubi managed to stop it, leveling the cemetery, shrines, and trees further up the slope. So, we don't have any place for the ashes of the dead? Setsuko asked. Misaki shook her head. There had been graves ready for Takashi and Takaru beside their fathers since the brothers reached their 30s, but the wind had scattered headstones, ashes, and bones of 10 generations of Matsudas across the mountain. I heard the Aminos have sent for monks to help with all the ceremonies, Setsuko said. That's good. Misaki tried to sound reassuring. They'll know what to do. But how much good could any Fina really do in this situation? So many dead children. So many dead without warning. Was there any ceremony that could purge the miasma of so much pain? Where is Takeru-sama? Setsuko asked. I don't know. Misaki shrugged. Still giving the volunteers directions, maybe. I don't know. Frankly, she didn't care. He had left Mamoru to die. And for what? So he could arrive in the village just in time to try to stop Misaki from going to save Hairi? Has he prayed for Mamoru? I don't know. Misaki shrugged again. It doesn't matter. Of course it matters. Setsuko trailed off, staring at Misaki in confusion. You're upset with him, she said after a moment. And you're not, Misaki said. He left your husband to die. He also saved me. Your husband saved you, Misaki snapped. Takeru was just following orders. Well, you can't exactly blame him for leaving the front line then, can you? Setsuko said. If he was just following orders? Misaki didn't answer. She did, however, tug Setsuko's arm when she noticed Yukino Dai's body passing on one of the stretchers. The swordmaster's face was covered with a cloth, which would have made him indistinguishable from the other Yukino men who had died holding the line, but Misaki recognized his katana resting in the stretcher at his side. Of all the beautiful swords in Takayubi, Takanagi was the one Misaki had envied. Lighter than other kotetsu swords and so breathtakingly fast in Dai's hands. She knew with a sad certainty that no swordsman would be worthy of the weapon again. We should go, Setsuko said softly. Misaki nodded. Leaving their children under the watchful eyes of the kotetsus and some fisherwomen, the sisters-in-law went to be with Hairi. They found her where she had collapsed that morning, half draped over the fallen stone Yukino insignia. Her head was resting in the crook of her arm as if she were sleeping, but Misaki knew before crouching down to Hairi's eye level that she wasn't asleep. There was a brittle tension in her shoulders that could only come from waking pain. Hairi-chan. Misaki rested a hand on her friend's back. She was so stiff, and still that for a horrible moment, she reminded Misaki of the corpses in the snow, rigid with a combination of ice and rigor mortis. She didn't move as the men lowered Dai onto the ice slab next to the bundled remains of his son. Hairi-chan. Misaki said again. Dazed eyes blinked and she said miserably, what? They found your husband's body. Hairi turned away from Misaki with a strained sound of denial, like the bleating of a lamb in the wolf's jaws. No. She buried her face in her arms. No. You should at least give him your prayers, Hairi-chan, Setsuko said softly, so he can move on in peace. He loved you so much. Hairi only curled more tightly against the stone, her knees twitching up to her chest. I can't. What do you mean, Hairi-chan? I'm not worthy, Hairi said in a voice smothered with pain and muffled in her sleeves. I shouldn't touch him. I shouldn't even look at him. Hairi-chan, what are you talking about? I failed him. What? Setsuko looked confused. Are you talking about Ryota-kun? Hairi-chan, that wasn't your fault. Hairi flinched away from the hand Setsuko tried to lay on her shoulder and huddled into herself, shaking her head. Misaki hadn't told Setsuko about what that last Ranganese soldier had done to their friend, and she never would. That wasn't the sort of a thing that a Kaigenese lady would ever put into words. The shame was too deep. Misaki waited until Setsuko had stepped away to pay her respects to Dai before kneeling in the snow to put an arm around Hairi's shoulders. She tried to make her voice low and soft, as her mother always had, trying to capture that magical power to comfort. Hairi, she murmured, putting her forehead to her friend's hair. It wasn't your fault. Hairi didn't pull away. She curled up tighter with a tiny, miserable noise, but Misaki refused to let her friend shrink away into the darkness. Not because of one man's disgraceful behavior. He was stronger than you. There was nothing you could have done for your son or yourself. Your husband, of all people, would understand that. Any warrior who knows victory and defeat would understand. Hairi sniffed, and though Misaki couldn't see the tears, she could feel salty water seeping from Hairi's eyes into her sleeve. Dai-san treasured you. He would never have stopped loving you for something that wasn't your fault. Why, you think? Hairi stammered, and through the grief, there was the faintest flicker of something that made Misaki melt with relief. Hope. You think he could forgive me? No, Hayori-chan. Misaki lifted a hand to stroke her friend's head. He doesn't have to. There is nothing to forgive. But I'm not pure anymore. Someone took that from you, Misaki said fiercely, dishonorably. Just like someone took his life from him. You think he was killed dishonorably? Don't be ridiculous, Hayori-chan. Who could kill Lightning Dai in a fair fight? Misaki didn't mention that Dai's head appeared to have been shattered by an attack from behind. That was the sort of detail a delicate thing like Hayori wouldn't appreciate, and apparently, it wasn't necessary, because the most fragile of smiles had crossed Hayori's face. It was the most beautiful thing Misaki had ever seen, and she squeezed her friend, desperate to hold on to it. I suppose you're right, Hayori said hesitantly. The people who did this, who fought without honor and destroyed without conscience, they are the ones who will burn in hell's fire for this. Not your husband. Not you. Are you sure? Positive, Misaki said. If there is anyone here now who needs Dai-san's forgiveness, it's me. What are you talking about? I should have gotten there sooner. I knew you could be in danger. I should have gone to check on you as soon as I knew my children were safe. Nami, forgive me. I knew the Ranganese attack might be coming. I had so many chances to do something, but I failed you. I failed everyone. So, let me ask Dai-san for forgiveness, and you. Misaki drew back to hold Hayori's shoulders in a bracing grip, trying to will strength into her. You just send him all your love. All right? Hayori was shaky, tears still trembling in her eyes, but she nodded. All right. After Hayori finished praying, Misaki and Setsuko sat with her. Neither had any words to ease her agony. But in the end, the words they chose didn't seem to matter. Hayori just knelt and stared numbly at the body, seemingly unable to see or hear what was around her. They stayed anyway and held her hands as if their presence could make her any less alone. Misaki was still murmuring soft reassurances when the flutter of familiar colors caught her eye. Oh. She stood, wondering if she had imagined the symbol, but it was real. The white-crested wave of the Tsusano family, rising among the Amino banners. Setsuko nodded to Misaki as if to say, I'll look after her. Misaki squeezed her arm in a silent, thank you. Hayori-chan, excuse me a moment. She brushed a hand over Hayori's back before hurrying as quickly as was ladylike to meet the Tsusano party. Her eyes fell immediately on her father's blue and silver haori, but when the Tsusano leader turned to face her, it was not her father. Kazuku-an. Her voice broke. She had never been so happy to see her dumb baby brother, and she found herself lurching toward him. Maybe the emptiness of letting Mamoru go was too fresh in her heart. Maybe Kazu's face was just a reminder of a time before any of this. Before she found the self-control to stop herself, she had thrown her arms around him. The Lord of the Storm Fort grunted in surprise, opened his mouth as if to say something, but ended up coughing as Misaki crushed him tighter in her arms. He smelled like salt and sea wind, like a home that no longer existed. She had to let Mamoru go, but at least Kazu was here. She could hold him like this, like she had when they were little children, and he had run into her room afraid of the thunder. Nei-san. Kazu could not have sounded more shocked if she'd punched him in the face. When they were young, she had always been the one scolding him for breaches of decorum. If he had ever clung to her this way in public, she would have smacked him away and hissed that that was no way for a young lord to behave. Nei-san, are you all right? He asked as Misaki drew back. Are you insane? The implication was there. What happened? Misaki shook her head, unable to voice it. Kazu's men were staring, their expressions ranging from shock to worry. Through her haze of emotion, she realized that she recognized some of them. They were members of the Tsusano's vassal families, who had served her father and trained in his dojo as children. Amiro-san, Hakuyu-san. She detached herself from Kazu to bow properly. It's good to see you again. Matsuda Dono. They bowed deeply. How are things in Ishihama? Misaki asked, turning from the vassal men back to her brother. How is our family? Our parents are comfortably set up with our cousins and everyone else has a place to stay in the short term at least. Good, Misaki nodded. Good, I'm so glad. Unlike Takayubi, which was surrounded by poor fishing and farming villages, Ishihama had neighboring towns capable of accommodating a small influx of refugees. But Ishihama was only attacked a short while ago. How, I know what you're going to say, Nei-san, Kazu said with a guilty smile. I probably shouldn't have left home so soon after the disaster, but I've left Kaido and Raiki to look after the family. Right. Misaki had forgotten that even her youngest brothers were well into their 20s now, perfectly capable of looking after the family in Kazu's absence. Still, the timing didn't add up. How did you get here so fast? Ishihama wasn't that close to Takayubi, and the roads weren't good. How did you? We started traveling 2 days ago, Kazu said, by sea. By sea? Misaki exclaimed in surprise. A group of powerful Jajakalu could propel themselves across a body of water on hydrodynamic ice formations faster than any car or train. But despite its speed, free ocean travel was a dangerous method of transportation, usually reserved for emergencies. Even the most powerful Jajakalu were foolish to put themselves at the mercy of the ocean. Kazu and his men must have crossed hundreds of cliques of open sea, far from the coast, to get here so fast. It certainly explained why they all looked so exhausted. You must have left Ishihama before the Ranganese even got here, Misaki said in confusion. We'll talk about that later, Kazu said. I'm sorry it has to be under these circumstances, but it's good to see your face, Nei-san. Misaki nodded and took a moment to look her brother up and down. At 32, this Kazu was far removed from the giggly, hyperactive boy who had cried at the sound of thunder. To Misaki's surprise, he looked, well, lordly, with his benevolent gaze and his shoulders filling out the haori that had once belonged to their father. The Tsusano's massive ancestral sword, Anryu, the Riptide, was tied to his back, marking him not only as the head of his house, but Ishihama's foremost warrior. His skin was littered with cuts and bruises that looked like they had come from falling rubble. A few of the deeper wounds on his face were obviously going to scar, despite the well-knit scabs he had formed over them. Amused surprise flickered through Misaki as she realized that Kazu wasn't going to look bad with scars. He was going to look hardened, intimidating. Eyes trailing down, she tilted her head at a deeper wound across his right collarbone that looked suspiciously like the work of a blade. Kazu quickly pulled the neck of his kimono up to cover the injury. You know, I forget how cold it is up here. Misaki gave him a knowing look. None of her younger brothers had ever shared her proclivity for deception, but Kazu had always been the worst liar of the bunch. And you look like you had some fun? Kazu's eyes passed over Misaki's bruises and the cuts the fan wielder had left on her forearms. A normal brother would have worried for his sister, but Kazu undoubtedly remembered all the times Misaki had trounced him in the Tsusano dojo and knew to worry for her enemies more than anyone else. Misaki-ne-san. He lowered his voice so the others wouldn't hear. You didn't go to the front lines. Oh, Kazu-kun, I'm flattered that you assume I would have survived that, but I didn't have to. She gestured to the wrecked village behind her. The front lines came to me. We should have gotten here sooner. He sounded pained. Have the military representatives arrived yet? He glanced around him, and Misaki saw an echo of the jumpy boy who had been so scared of the thunder. No. I mean, planes showed up to bomb every last Fanyaka off the mountainside, but no one has spoken to us yet. I haven't seen any Imperial troops on the ground. Good. What? Not here, Kazu said quickly. So, did you know? She asked. The storm you wrote me about. Was it really a storm, or I said not here, he repeated more firmly. Misaki-ne-san, I'm sorry. I know this is a difficult time for you, but I need to speak privately with your brother-in-law. Can you take me to him? Misaki shook her head. Matsuda Takashi didn't survive the battle. My husband is the head of the house now. Oh, Kazu said as a few of his men uttered sounds of surprise and denial. I'm so sorry. Can you take me to your husband then? Yes. Misaki nodded. Yes, of course. I'm so sorry. You and your men must be tired and hungry. I would invite you inside for tea, but there isn't much left of my kitchen, or the whole house, really. She nodded toward the Matsuda compound. What about your family? Kazu asked anxiously. Other than your brother-in-law, Naima to his soul, is everyone all right? Misaki looked down, pressing her lips together. Nei-san? "Come with me," she said softly. Kazu and his men followed her through the breach in the compound wall to where the volunteers had laid the dead. Mamoru's body had been covered, but the boy's katana rested beside him, and Kazu knew his nephew's sword. "Oh, Nasan." His voice shook. For a moment, he looked as he had when he was a boy, on the verge of tears. A lord of the house did not cry in front of his men, of course, but Misaki found herself feeling ridiculously grateful for her brother's moment of weakness. It was good to know that one of the men in her life cared that Mamoru was gone. One by one, Kazu and his men paid their respects to Mamoru, bowing before the body and offering their prayers. Unable to watch, Misaki turned from the scene and went to find her husband, as Kazu had asked. She hadn't spoken to Takeru since the previous day when he had tried to stop her from going back for Hiri. He must have heard by now that Mamoru's body had been found. His firstborn son was dead. But the knowledge didn't seem to affect him as he swept about the village, organizing supplies and ordering volunteers around. "I'm busy," were the first words out of his mouth when he saw her. "I know, Takeru-sama." She lowered her gaze, made her voice soft. It was the only way to hold off the anger simmering in her throat. "I'm sorry, but my brother, Lord Susano, is here to see you. He says it is urgent." Amino-san, Takeru addressed the lead representative from the Amino family. "Please, take over operations here." "Yes, Matsuda Dono." The man bowed. "I hope to be back shortly," Takeru said, and followed Misaki to where Kazu was waiting. He walked right past his son's body without so much as glancing at it. "Susano Dono," he said with a cordial bow. "It has been a long time. I am glad to see you here." "Likewise, Matsuda Dono," Kazu said, dipping into his own bow, notably lower than Takeru's. Misaki knew that her brother had always been intimidated by Takeru, but he did an admirable job hiding it as he straightened back up. "I am deeply sorry for your loss." Takeru offered a gruff nod. "But it is good to see that my sister's husband, at least, survived the attack," Kazu added. "I'm relieved to know she will be taken care of." Another nod. "Is there someplace more private we could talk, Matsuda Dono?" Kazu asked. "Regrettably, my house is occupied by the wounded at the moment." "Somewhere else then?" "Out of earshot of everyone." Takura nodded. "Follow me, Susano Dono." "Misaki, you may leave us," he added over his shoulder. "No, I would prefer that she come along, if that's all right with you, Matsuda Dono," Kazu said haltingly. "She is my sister, so I'd like her to hear what I have to say as well." "I would think, as her husband, you wouldn't mind, fine," Takeru said with a dark look at Misaki, "but you will keep your mouth shut." "Yes, sir," she said quietly. Kazu's eyes flicked from his sister to Takeru in obvious discomfort, but he didn't say anything. It wasn't his place to say anything. Not only was Takeru the new Matsuda patriarch, but he was also more than 10 years Kazu's senior. A young lord didn't comment on an older lord's treatment of his woman, even if the woman in question was a sister who had once rocked a certain young lord to sleep and taught him his first sword forms. "Do you have anyone else you would like to include, Matsuda Dono?" Kazu asked. "What?" "I'm sure you have other men you trust," Kazu said. "Men you would like included in this meeting?" Kazu was so ready to accept Takeru's authority, it probably didn't occur to him that the second-born Matsuda hadn't even been the head of the house for a full day. "My brother's closest confidants were myself and Yukino Dai," Takeru said. "The latter is dead." "Lightning Dai," Kazu said in shock. "He's gone too. We lost most of our best." Takeru slowed his steps before what remained of the Mizumaki house, where Kwang Chulhi and his father were helping the Amino men organize and distribute the meager supplies the volunteers had brought up the mountain. He seemed to consider for a moment, his eyes passing over each of the high-ranking Amino men, the 2 surviving Mizumaki elders, and the crippled Katakuri man, who had been unable to join the fight. The visiting Aminos, while they were doing a wonderful job helping, were not typically very involved in Takayubi affairs. The Mizumakis and Katakuris were close and trusted allies, but these remaining men were not their leaders. Katakuri Hisato, with the twisted leg, was a 5th son who had spent his entire adult life working as a cashier in the Western Village's convenience store. The Mizumaki elders had been fine men in their prime, But these days one could only remember half of what he heard, and the other could not hear at all. Takeru's eyes narrowed in thought. Then he made up his mind. Kwang Taemin. Yes! The northerner looked up. Your son can take over the work you are doing, yes? Taemin glanced at Chulhi. Sure. You will come with me. Oh, Taemin looked surprised. Of course. Just give me a moment. He's a northerner, Kazu whispered with an apprehensive look at Takeru. Kwang Taemin may have foregone his hanbok and bogolan vest in favor of a Shirajima-style kimono, but his accent was unmistakable. He's not one of us. He is a citizen of the Empire, as we are, Takeru said, and he is well-traveled, giving him insights we might not have. Misaki had plenty of the same insights, although Takeru didn't seem particularly interested in listening when they came from her mouth. He is also one of the few men of sound mind who survived. He didn't fight, I take it, Kazu said. His strengths lie in other areas, Takeru said. The two of us have spent a few months now working together on one of the mayor's projects. All Misaki knew of her husband's relationship with Kwang Taemin was that the two had worked together closely on the plan for the Infocom towers. She knew that Takeru had been the one to suggest the project in the first place, and he had evidently grown close to the northerner as they worked together to make it a reality. Takeru was always pressing for more modern development, a paved road one year, better power lines the next, and on the rare occasions his projects were approved, he was always the one who ended up managing them. The mayor was, or rather had been, more of a figurehead, a dull but harmless government official, content to let his staff do his job better than he could. The Empire didn't typically send its best and brightest to oversee tiny mountain villages. And the mayor? Kazu asked. Dead, Takeru said, displaying no emotion for the man who had employed him for many years. He was at home in the western village when they came. Having finished giving instructions to his son, Kwang Taemin hurried over. Susanoo Dono, this is Kwang Taemin, a representative from Geomagical Communications, Takeru said. Kwang-san, this is Susanoo Kazu of Ishihama, lord of the Arashiki and my wife's brother. After the two men bowed and exchanged greetings, Takeru led them out of the village, up toward the mountain's summit. The snow grew deeper as they ascended, but it parted before them at the touch of Takeru's jia. Two of Kazu's men followed them up until Kazu turned to them. Stay here, he ordered. Ensure that nobody follows us. Yes, sir. As the men took up position in the snow, Misaki had the feeling that her suspicions were about to be confirmed. This attack and whatever had taken place in Ishihama were connected, and the government was going to considerable trouble to hide it. Takeru led them to a snowy clearing overlooking Kimono Academy. The temple-turned school was the only structure that seemingly hadn't been touched by bombs or phonia. It stood as proud and serene as ever against the rock. Perhaps it was too high up the mountain, too removed from most of the action, for anyone to have bothered with it. The climb had certainly taxed Misaki's aching lungs. Now then, Lord Susanoo. Takeru turned to Kazu. What was it you wanted to discuss? Kazu started hesitantly. First, I wanted to apologize for not warning you properly. Explain. As I'm sure you've guessed, Takayubi wasn't the only town the Ranganese attacked in these past few weeks. They came to Ishihama as well. That was what destroyed the Arashiki and the surrounding town, not a storm as the news reported. Takeru nodded as if he had suspected this the whole time, as if he hadn't slapped his son around the dojo for suggesting it. Based on where all the other so-called storms hit the coast, we, my father, and I, figured the Ranganese were targeting Kaigen's old warrior houses. We thought Takayubi might be next. Of course, we hoped not, but… Kazu shook his head. The least I can do is warn you about what is going to happen next. What do you mean? Takeru asked. Should we be expecting more attacks? No, Matsuda Dono, Kazu said hastily. Nothing like that. I wanted to warn you about the Kaigenese military before they get here. At the look of confusion on Takeru's face, Kazu continued, there is a reason I couldn't explain our situation in the letter I wrote my sister. As soon as the Kaigenese troops arrived in Ishihama, they made it clear that we were not to discuss the attack amongst ourselves or tell anyone else what had happened. Takeru's brow had furrowed in thought. Why? I don't know. Kazu shook his head. They wouldn't tell us, but it was clear that they were trying to keep news of these attacks contained. The Emperor's soldiers even moved us all into the neighboring town while the Yamenka troops helped them clean up the damage. The Yamenkalu are involved? Misaki asked. It wasn't unusual for Kaigen's more powerful ally to give them military support, especially where Ranga was concerned, but it added a new level of complexity to the situation. Yama was its own player, with its own motives. Yes, the Yamenka soldiers were there almost as soon as our own military. How did they act? Misaki asked. Did they say anything to you, or you were told not to speak? Takaru said shortly. Again, Kazu's eyes flicked uncomfortably between Misaki and her husband. He might not have had the courage or authority to speak up for his sister, but he did answer her question. The Yamenkalu barely interacted with us. Most of them communicated only with the Kaigenese military and then went to help with the cleanup, or whatever it is they're doing in the area affected by the attack. We haven't been allowed back in to find the bodies of family members or retrieve belongings. I don't know if anything's changed, but that was where things stood when I left. And you think we can expect something similar here in Takayubi? Takaru asked. Maybe. I just wanted to warn you before the Kaigenese troops arrived. I'm so sorry, my men, and I didn't make better time, he added earnestly. I'm sorry we weren't able to offer more meaningful support. Don't apologize, Takaru said. As you saw, our warriors were more than sufficient to hold the hostiles back until the Emperor's forces arrived. He said it with his usual disinterest, as if the deaths of his brother, his son, and so many civilians meant nothing. We didn't face anything like this in Ishihama, Kazu said. The Ranganese didn't send as many soldiers? I don't know. I think most of the Ranganese involved in the attack never actually reached us. The Tsusanos town, perched high atop that sheer cliff, was far more defensible than Takayubi, or indeed any place in the world, as far as Misaki knew. No army in history had ever breached it, and she was relieved to hear that even this terrifying new Ranganese force was no exception. Did they attack with a tornado? Takaru asked. Initially, yes. When we saw it forming over the water, my father realized almost immediately that it was the Ranganese. Oh? Had your father encountered Fanikalu before? Takaru asked, probably thinking of how he and Takashi had been uncomprehending in the face of the tornado for several Seiranu until Misaki and Chulhi had convinced them that it was the work of the Ranganese. She wondered with annoyance if he had the decency to be embarrassed. No, Matsuda Dano. He's just not an idiot. Misaki thought angrily. I think, Kazu said more tactfully, my father had just seen so many hundreds of storms in his life that he could sense right away when one was not behaving normally. Knowing that the houses nearest the edge were lost, we evacuated as many homes as we could and gathered the warriors to face any Ranganese who made it ashore. And? The tornado broke apart when it hit the cliff, Kazu said, and it didn't surprise Misaki that the Ishihama cliff had done what even the jagged rocks and steep slope of Mount Takayubi could not. Obviously, our Arashiki was destroyed, along with the houses that sat near the edge. The wind off the tornado threw some of the Ranganese over the lip of the cliff, about 24, I think. We killed them. That explained the blade wound across Kazu's clavicle. The rest of the Ranganese, I assume, tried to scale the cliff, but they didn't make it before the Yamenkalu showed up to shoot them down. Takara nodded. So, you did not suffer heavy casualties? Only 2 of our warriors died in combat, but the flying debris caused devastation for cliques around. Unfortunately, there wasn't time to evacuate the entire area, and the tornado shattered the weaker parts of the cliff's edge, raining rocks on us, some as big as houses. Many people were killed by those rocks, we think close to 100. You think? That's how many were missing after we reached safety and took count, but like I said, we haven't been back to our houses and the soldiers won't tell us anything. He shook his head. I just wonder what they stand to gain from covering all of this up. A sense of security, Misaki thought. If news of the attack spread, people might panic and become more difficult to control. Then again, that didn't explain what secretive business the Yamenkalu were up to. It doesn't matter, Takaru said. Thank you for the warning, but it is not our business to question the will of the Emperor. If these are his orders, our only job is to obey. Matsuda, Taemin said, looking uneasy. I get the feeling you may not like what the emperor asks of you. What are you talking about? Kazu asked, shifting to Kaijengwa as he turned to Taemin. I know that the media would suggest that the heart of the empire is strong and overflowing with resources, but I'm a native of Yongsan, and I just think. Taemin paused, looking apprehensively between the two Shirajima men. He was taking a gamble. He didn't know Kazu, and how well could one really know Takaru? The reality of the Imperial Army is very different from the image it projects. He turned to Kazu. If the military has already made an appearance in Ishihama, you already have some idea. Well, Kazu was frowning. I didn't interact with the soldiers very much. The hesitation in his voice revealed that there was some truth to what Kwang Taemin said. I don't say this to belittle the empire or to upset you, Susanoo, the northerner said carefully, but Matsuda. He looked to Takaru. Your village is in a difficult position at the moment. So far, we've accounted for 42 living, many of whom are injured. You have only what remains of the Matsuda compound and the very little that remains of the Mizumaki house to accommodate all those people. My son is still inventorying the food we've recovered, but it isn't going to be enough to feed many, I'm aware of that, Kwang, Takaru said tersely. What does this have to do with the military? I just want to warn you. I don't want you to make the mistake of assuming you can rely on the empire to support your community through this time. I've been around enough to know that you will be disappointed. You shouldn't say such things of the empire, Kazu said, his frown deepening. So, your town has received the aid it needs, Susanoo? Taemin asked. I didn't stay long after the attack, Kazu said. I'm sure they have by now. He didn't sound sure. Besides, Ishihama didn't need aid the way Takayubi does. My people still have roofs to sleep under, a way to get back on our feet. If this village doesn't get help, it will cease to exist, Misaki thought grimly. Whatever the emperor orders, our only job is to obey, Takaru reiterated firmly. His words made it sound simple, as if lives didn't hang in the balance. It is a privilege to serve the Kaigenese Empire in whatever way we can. Of course, Kazu agreed, but I will admit that all of this is strange. Not just the business with the imperial troops and the Yamankulu, the attacks themselves don't seem logical. What do you mean? Takaru asked. A smart fighter strikes at his enemy's weak points. Yes. So, what is Ranga doing launching these concentrated attacks on the towns of Kaigen's most powerful fighters? If their goal was to penetrate into the interior and they had the element of surprise, why target the homes of the people most likely to repel them? Kazu made a surprisingly good point. It was like deliberately aiming a sword stroke at armor or a blood needle at bone. At worst, doomed, at best, wasteful. There were so many places a Ranganese force of this size and skill could have come ashore and killed everyone with ease, or even snuck through completely unnoticed in the night. Maybe penetration wasn't their goal, Misaki suggested, even as Takara shot her a disapproving look. These attacks could be part of a more complicated plan. Maybe their intention was to weaken the great houses. At the cost of so many soldiers? Kazu said incredulously. There again, he had a point. There were ways to do away with your enemies without losing hundreds of good fighters. Granted, none of the ways that came to mind were particularly honorable. Most of Misaki's immediate thoughts involved assassins and poison, but slaughtering children was not honorable. Burning blacksmiths in their homes was not honorable. Raping your enemy's women was not honorable. If the Ranganese were willing to commit those atrocities, why not stoop to poison or a single well-placed bomb? Why sacrifice so many fighters? The rank-and-file soldiers in yellow may have been an expendable resource to the Ranganese Union, but those soldiers in black were 1 in 10,000. When Misaki had been at daybreak, Ranganese special forces had been limited to Ranga's strongest bloodlines, Xing and Tian. Soldiers of their caliber were incalculably valuable assets. Why send dozens of them to die in a head-on battle? Before the men had a chance to discuss further, one of Kazu's fighters ran up the slope to them and stopped, panting, winded from the climb. He cut off, struggling to catch his breath, his lungs unaccustomed to Takayubi's thin air. Sorry to interrupt, Matsuda Dano, Susanoo Dano. He bowed. What is it, Hakuyu-san? Kazu asked. The imperial troops have arrived. They're asking for the head of the village. Hakuyu looked to Takaru as he straightened up. I told them that was you, Matsuda Dono. I'll be right there.